skal vi møte en gigant i den internasjonale forfatterverdenen. En mann med hele 5 populærvitenskapelige millionselgere på samvittigheten. I sin nye bok David og Goliat undersøker han den såkalte underdog og viser hvordan et liv i motgang kan gi medgang til sist. Please welcome Malcolm Gladwell. Welcome.
Thank you.
Did you have fun with the Hoff backstage, or?
Well, I didn't see him. I'm hoping to make his acquaintance later. It's a highlight.
He's here, right?
I hope so.
I hope so too. First of all, what is an underdog?
An underdog is someone on the lopsided end of any kind of competition. Someone without obvious advantages, and I am fascinated by the fact that people without obvious advantages often do very well in the world.
The underdog is also very often, my impression is that the underdog is very often the hero of the story.
Yeah, this is one of the things that got me so interested in the topic, because the story of David and Goliath transcends the Bible. It's all around the world, people relate to that story because it's this classic tale of the little boy and the giant, and all of us are rooting for the little boy, right? And that the notion that we have a kind of instinctive sympathy for the smaller and weaker of the parties, or apparently weaker of the parties, is what makes this question of underdogs so fascinating.
Because poor Goliath, he never gets to the sympathy. He
doesn't. Although well, in the book I talk about this fact that a lot of biblical scholars now believe that Goliath suffered from a condition called acromegaly, which is a tumor on your pituitary gland, which causes his size. It's the cause of giantism. Very often when we see very, very big people, very tall, they have this particular tumor. And it also causes problems with vision. And if you read the biblical story very closely, it's sort of obvious that Goliath can't see. He's led onto the valley floor by an attendant. It takes him forever to realize that David's not planning to fight him with swords. He reacts very slowly. He keeps saying, "Come to me," as if it sounds like a boast, but then you realize, no, he's saying that because he wants David to come close enough that he can actually look at him.
So he's actually the underdog.
Well, he's
sick and blind.
When you look very closely, you realize, and this is one of the paradoxes that I explore in the book, which is people who appear, the giant appears to be this overwhelming, powerful, intimidating figure. But the closer you look at giants, the more vulnerable you realize they are. And that's, in the Bible, it instructs us to do that. There's a line in Samuel which says, don't get fooled by someone's size or strength, look in the heart. And that's what it's about. It's about don't be misled by apparent advantage.
You probably knew this, right?
Of course, I knew the story, of course.
Did you know he was blind and sick?
No, I haven't heard this theory, but I know it says in the Bible that at that time there was giant in the words.
Yeah.
But I agree, it's possible.
The desirable difficulty is a term you use.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Well, this is an idea, a fascinating idea that comes out of learning theory. And it says that usually when we want to explain why someone learns something, we look for all of the ways in which that process was made easier. But this theory says, actually, there are also cases where we can help someone learn something by making their task harder. So if I do something that forces you, if a child is learning homework, and you change the nature of the task such that that child is forced to concentrate, or read what they're doing 3 times instead of once, or focus in a way they didn't have to focus. In other words, if you make it harder in such a way that causes them to do the job with more effort and persistence, then they'll actually learn more than they would have if the job was too easy. I have a whole chapter on this fascinating fact that a very large percentage of successful entrepreneurs are dyslexic. And this raises the question of, in some cases, could dyslexia be a desirable difficulty? In other words, if I take away from someone the ability to read easily, can they compensate in ways that make them better off? So I have in that chapter, I talk to a very famous trial lawyer in America who is profoundly dyslexic. He's a lawyer, difficulty reading. And what he will say to you is, because he couldn't read, he learned how to listen and learned and developed his memory. He got through school as a child by zeroing in on the teacher, listening to everything they said and committing it to memory. So he becomes a trial lawyer, and all of a sudden, what can he do better than everyone else? When he's cross-examining a witness, hear every single nuance, every fact, memorize it, and then 3 days later he'll say, but 2 days ago you said this and this and this and this, and now you're contradicting yourself, right? So this is it's a really fascinating notion.
So what you're saying is that I should really wish dyslexia upon my children, or
well, no. So I raised this question to all of these successful. So I interviewed a dozen very successful people who are dyslexic, and I asked them this question. All of them would say that all these people I interviewed said that their own success was a product of their handicap. They succeeded because of their dyslexia, not in spite of it. And I said to them, well, would you wish this on your child then? And they all said no, that it was too painful. Even though it was what made them who they were, they wouldn't put any of their children through it, which is a very kind of sobering side of it.
I know they translated the show to you before you came in here. Would you say that the disadvantages that you had in your childhood, obviously, can have been some kind of, well, of course not an advantage, but some kind of
some good
form,
Yeah. Well, it's funny, I have a whole chapter on parental loss, and on this really striking fact that if you look at cohorts of very successful people, I use the example of British prime ministers and American presidents, the percentage of the people in those two groups who lost at least one parent before the age of 16 is far higher than the general population. In other words, we see these patterns that in certain people, going through that most painful of experiences deepened and strengthened them in ways they would never otherwise have, in a way they would never otherwise have gone through. And I thought of that when I heard your story. I wondered about, you went through something, unfathomably difficult, and yet you were saying that you were transformed in some way.
Definitely, definitely. It has so much to do with my drive, definitely to say.
So do you plan to be American president as well?
Well, not until now.
Now you can,
You're better.
Exactly.
You sound better qualified than most of them. So
thank you.
The bar is quite low to become American president.
So much.
Can the underdog develop special skills?
Yes.
Is that what you're saying?
That's the sort of point of the... I talk a lot about the idea of disagreeableness, which is at the core of the strength of the underdog. And by that I don't mean obnoxiousness. I mean that in the psychological sense of that word, which is someone is disagreeable who doesn't require the approval of their peers in order to do something. And I give the example in that chapter of the great Swedish entrepreneur Ingvar Kamprad, who is famously disagreeable. He does something.
The man behind IKEA.
Yeah, the man, when he builds IKEA, the crucial moment in IKEA's history is when he is getting shut out of the Swedish market and being boycotted by Swedish furniture manufacturers. And he moves his manufacturing operations to Poland in 1961, when to set up a factory in a communist country was unheard of. It was, people turned their backs on him and denounced him, but he was magnificently disagreeable. He didn't need people to pat him on the back and say, you're a good person, to do the thing that he wanted to do. And that is an incredible advantage. By the way, Ingvar Kamprad, dyslexic, I would point out.
And disagreeable. And you mean disagreeable.
And disagreeable. I think, one of the...
Have you met him?
I tried to meet him. I'm fascinated by him because he's really, I don't need to tell, I know you're apparently Norwegian, but I don't need to tell Swedes about how extraordinary he is. But he's also quite reclusive, so it was hard to.
And like your character, Karlmerk is very disagreeable as well.
Yes, yeah, of course.
He solves the case, doesn't
We
he?
need disagreeableness in the world.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, we need people who have that ability to defy conventional wisdom.
Still, when we look at the Goliaths in the world and the Davids in the world, isn't it true that 9 out of 10 times the Goliath will win?
It is true that Goliaths...
Most top lawyers
often
won't have dyslexia.
I know, but what's interesting is if you talk very closely, so I had a chapter in my previous book, Outliers, about the most successful lawyers in New York City, almost all of whom were the children of Jewish immigrants who grew up in poverty in the Bronx, and when they tried to enter the legal profession, were discriminated against and were forced to practice the least lucrative kind of law in the least prestigious firms. So even they, you know, when they explained their success, said that it came not from advantage, but from adversity. So it made me think, you know, I think that when you look closely at any number of situations, that you'll see far more Davids than Goliaths. In other words, the mistake we make when we look at the world is to assume that most success comes from obvious advantage.
What do you say when people criticize you for cherry picking stories that fits into your theory?
That is what all of us do.
Exactly.
And that's what we ought to do. I mean, the thing that a thinking person does is they go out into the world and they weigh all of the evidence and they choose the evidence that they find the most compelling, right? When I discuss global warming, I don't say, well, on the one hand, there are those who believe it's real, and on the others, there are those who think it. No, I look at the evidence and I decide that those who deny global warming are fools. And so I don't spend time, you know, is that cherry picking? No, that's being an intelligent human being.
Good point. Good point. Next week we have Bill Gates on the show.
Oh wow!
I wonder, would you say that he went from David to Goliath?
He did. Very much. You know, the story of Microsoft, it begins as this little upstart, right? That takes on IBM and is transformed very rapidly into the Goliath that it is today. So he's seen he's had the full journey from one end of the continuum to another. So I'm sure. I mean, he's a deeply interesting man. I'm sure he has much to say on this topic.
How do you think he will be remembered?
Well, I have said,
he's sort of building his
legacy.
Yes, his legacy.
Yeah, I have said, and this was at the time when I said it a few years ago, it was very unpopular, that I thought that Steve Jobs will be forgotten by future generations and Bill Gates will be remembered. And he'll be remembered because what he's doing right now in terms of philanthropy is extraordinary. I mean, it is one of the most impressive accomplishments of our generation.
Giving away his
But it's more than that. He's taken an extraordinary fortune and he's giving it away, but he is giving it away in a disciplined, intelligent manner. He has applied all of his extraordinary intelligence to the task of how can I make the most of this, you know, how can I identify and attack the problems that most need to be solved. And that he has set an example for an entire generation of wealthy people about how they are called to behave in the world.
I will tell him you said so.
Hope so.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being with us.